get started. I'm sure there'll be other folks that are trickling in, particularly since I assigned my students a paper that was due at 12 noon. So they may be just clicking submit and heading on over. Probably not the best planning on my part, but they asked for it instead. Welcome, I'm Doug Reed. I'm director of the MA program in Education Transformation here at Georgetown. We're a new program. We launched in July of 2017, so this is our second year. And last year we launched this speaker series as part of sort of building the intellectual climate at Georgetown about questions about race, class, equity, and excellence in education. And we want to bring in both intellectual and academic leaders in the study of those issues, but also activists who are leading the fight for educational equity and access across race, class, and linguistic lines. And this year, under the direction of Krista Stevens, our newest faculty member, I'm really excited about our schedule of talks. If you haven't picked up the flyer, here, we have them here, I believe, or we'll make them available soon. We've got 4 great talks mapped out, 2 this semester and 2 next semester. Each of them have 2 speakers come in. We try to promote a conversation across our speakers. Just before Krista introduces our speakers today, I just want to give a quick overview of the MA program for those of you who might be thinking about applying. It's a residency-based program. It's a 12-month program. It moves really quickly and it's really intense, but it's really exciting. One concentration is in advocacy and policy for folks who want to go into the work of nonprofits, foundation work, think tank work, or work for district level or state level or even local level agencies and working in this area of educational transformation. The other concentration that we have is in learning and teaching, and we just launched that this past July under the leadership of Professor Sabrina Wesley-Nero, who heads the learning and teaching concentration. And that's the first accredited teacher preparation program that Georgetown's ever had, so we're really happy about that. We are accredited to train teachers in ESL, ELL, and in secondary science. So if those are of interest, please contact me or our program coordinator, Krista Pluff, who does great work in explaining the relatively complicated but really fascinating work that we're doing. I also want to just draw attention to the fact that we've not only are we recruiting students, we're also recruiting faculty members. So if you guys know anybody who's interested, please spread the word. And also, I just want to draw attention that we do have a pretty aggressive financial aid policy for students who are interested in applying, especially this coming year. The graduate school generosity is going to make it possible to I think, really boost our financial aid. So I would also just like to thank Krista Pluff for the logistics for all this today and coordinating everyone's schedules and travels and all of that and the technology. And then we have a very complicated and awkward thing that we have not only Krista, but we have Krissa, who is our newest faculty member. So I want to thank her for providing leadership on coordinating the entire speaker series and bringing in today's guests. So Krista, if you'd like to introduce our guests, I'll get out of the way. Thank you.
Well, we're happy to have all of you here, and we're excited to introduce Dr. Will Liu, who's going to share our first talk about white supremacy and white privilege. Dr. Liu's scholarship focuses on the theory and practice of social justice, and his work centers on social class, classism, men, masculinity, and multiculturalism. And he has received many awards and honors in all of these different areas. And his work has really been shown to have a high impact in his field. He's currently working on a new book to be a synthesis of race, social class, gender, and more specifically, a critical race-based approach to psychology. He has recently published on this area, including on issues of white privilege and racial trauma. And he's currently writing a book that he's going to be sharing with us about today about white supremacy and white privilege for Oxford University Press. And he's writing this together with Rosina Liu. So we're thrilled to have him. And on a personal note, I will say that scholarship like Will's, I grew up in a very insular area, and in my own case, I didn't know that racism actually was a thing. And so it was scholarship like Will's that was my first entry point into understanding what that was, what my responsibility was in it, and what my role was. And so I'm really looking forward to having him share with all of you. And Dr. Lou.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And so I've got about a half hour or so, 40 minutes. I'm going to try to get through a fairly dense topic like white supremacy. I know it's not an easy topic, but it's also, I think, a very meaningful way for us to start thinking about racism as well as white privilege. And a lot of this is based on a question for my scholarship that I've asked myself for about 6 years. And that simple question was, what is white privilege? And that was, for 6 years, that's all I worked on, was trying to answer this one question: what is white privilege, and how is it that we've studied it? How is it that we've understood it? And what are the practices that we engage in terms of teaching it, right? In terms of, for many of us in here, when we come at it from a very social justice standpoint, what does it mean to talk about, let's say, white privilege, racism, white supremacy, all of these different terms? And for me, it felt very disparate, and I wanted to try to pull it together into something much more coherent, and for us to understand what all of those different pieces mean. And so for several years, I've started to stop talking about racism as racism. When I talk about racism in class, I talk about it as white supremacy, because there are different levels of how we're going to understand white supremacist ideology as well as white privilege and racism. And you'll start to, I think you'll start to see that they're not necessarily synonymous terms that we sort of flippantly use back and forth. And I think that's important in terms of construct, clarity, and what it is that we want to use in terms of terminology. So I've used this term for several years. And at a conference several years ago, I presented something very similar and started talking about white supremacy, racism, and another term that you'll start to hear me say in here as well is white spatialization, white space, white space. What is white space? And what happened was at our Q&A, one of the things that occurred was had a graduate student in the back, and it happened to be a white female graduate student, respond to me and say, I appreciate all of the things that you're presenting to me, and I hear what it is that you're saying, but don't you feel like it's too much? It's a lot for me to take in. It's really too much for me to sit with right now. And don't you think there's a reasonable way that you can, or you should, grade it? You should ease us into this discussion, right? Sounds fairly innocuous. And so, as an educator, of course, I go to my Vygotsky sort of sense, like, yes, you're right. We should sort of figure out a way for me to scaffold this learning process, right? To sort of ease people into, sort of build into it, build us into the language. That's my socialized, learned approach as an educator from all my years in higher education. That's my initial approach. And then my critical race part comes in and asks, why are you just learning about this now? Why are you presenting me with this question as to this is too much? What has taken you so long for you to have avoided this conversation altogether up until you're sitting in front of me and now you're listening to me present some of this information, right? And so from an epistemological standpoint, hence the topic of this presentation, the epistemology of white supremacy, other people have written about this quite a bit, and I go back to Charles Mill's work. And Charles Mills talks about this particular epistemological stance as white ignorance. Not being ignorant, white ignorance. And I'll explain what white ignorance is for those of you who aren't familiar with Charles Mills' work around this particular topic. But it is a kind of white ignorance, right, that they bring into the classroom setting. And I say classroom in particular because this is, for me as an educator, teaching undergraduates, teaching graduate students, master's level, doctoral students, training at the national level for other psychologists and mental health providers. It's the same thing. So it's not like it's only reserved for grad students or undergraduates. I get this regardless with whomever I present, which is, this is a lot of information. You gotta like ease us into it. You're starting to make me feel uneasy, right? White fragility. So you start to hear those aspects of white fragility. The other piece which is important too is this idea of white spatialization. White spatialization in this particular context is a meta communication or a very subliminal or subtle communication that this is my classroom and you are a visitor. You are a person of color visiting my classroom. So let me remind you, right, with some authority, that you should not do this kind of work. You should not shake us too much because this is not what I'm used to, white fragility. You're just a visitor of white socialization, right? And this is too much. Charles Mills, white ignorance. So what is white ignorance? So it's a very intentional term that Charles Mills uses, but it's not necessarily meant to be to identify people as ignorant. It's a particular epistemological stance that he gets at, which is white ignorance is very much predicated on the individual, right? It's the individual. It's the individual. It's the individual. Your worldview is the only thing that's important. Your particular stance is the only thing that's important. And this particular kind of epistemological stance is everywhere, right? It's everywhere. So for instance, as a psychologist, as a mental health provider, you can't avoid the term individual in almost any writing that we do, because it always boils down to the individual. In fact, I'll use Charles Mills again. Charles Mills would argue that it's so profound, it's so entrenched, it's so part of everything that we do as an epistemological stance that it's inimical, right? It's actually, it's hostile to anything that moves us away from that stance, right? People ask, well, how do you do that, right? And so that's the kind of question that you get with, is that it's so hostile to anything that's outside the individual that it recenters itself. You might hear other people talk about sort of recentering the individual, recentering whiteness. Other people will write about this in a different way, and they talk about it as very neoliberal stance, right? You'll hear that terminology as well. So it's all the same thing, which is, as an epistemological stance, it's all about the individual. So, but why is that important in terms of how we understand race, racism, white supremacy, white spatialization, white privilege, all of these different pieces? If we stay with the individual, right, it's simply that racism is a function of, it's an individual choice, it's an individual deviance. It's nothing more than somebody making a poor choice or somebody making a poor decision, right? And what you often hear when you sort of pull that person aside, you start to challenge them and say, well, that was pretty racist. And you say, no, I'm not racist. I'm a good person. I'm not racist at all. I mean, I might have done something wrong, but don't label me as a racist. Don't label me. I'm not a racist at all, right? So I'm a good person. And what the social psychological research says about that particular standpoint, I'm a good person, is important in terms of how we understand social structures and institutions, because system justification theory tells us that that person who thinks they're a good person will also imbue upon their system, their institutions, that the institutions are good as well, right? It's a generalization of oneself to the institutions. It's a system justification. person, I make decisions, therefore the institution I'm a part of can't be different than I am. The institution also makes good decisions, and therefore, at some other levels of research, there's a justification for inequality, there's a justification for racism, there's a justification for all of that, because there's the belief that the system overall is positive, good, beneficent. It always works for the benefit of the individual. Always works for the benefit of the individual. The other piece too that is important is that if we focus on the individual, we keep coming back to this really inane point. Really, and I try not to opine too much about these things, but it really becomes a point of intentionality, right? And so you ask the person, well, I was really racist with it. Well, I didn't intend to, right? That's not what my intention was. I didn't mean to do that. You know, it just sort of slipped out, right? Did that particular thing. So therefore, intentionality has a lot to do with how we start to identify what is racist or who is racist. And let me just tell you this. Intentionality is meaningless. Meaningless, right? So I'm going to be provocative here since meaningless. It is irrelevant in terms of how we want to understand racism, about a person's intention. Intentions, intentions are meaningless, right? Intentionality is meaningless, right? Because when we start talking about racist behaviors within white space, right? It's a very normalized activity. So intention has nothing to do with whether intention has nothing to do with whether something is considered racist. Acting, if you're a white person in a white system, in a white institution, within white social structures, your day-to-day activities are normal. So you don't even have to think outside of that to say, oh, I'm going to be intentionally racist here because I want to be. It's just, no, it's just I'm doing my own thing. And because I'm doing my thing, I can actually elicit and participate in racism as a result of that. So let me give you a short little story that sort of made it very poignant to me in terms of intentionality. At my old institution at the University of Iowa, when I left the building, I go out the back doors and I walk up the sidewalk up to the parking structure to get to my car. So it's a walk that I've done thousands of times, sort of not even thinking about what I was doing, but I'm walking up, you know, and sort of in my fog state of academic sort of thinking. I'm just sort of like thinking on my own and walking up the steps. And when I started to realize, one of the things that happened was that it was so unconscious to me as I was walking up the sidewalk that I would start to step aside when groups of white men approached me, mostly white men, right? They just, as they're walking down the sidewalk. Now, the sidewalk is only large enough for 2 lanes, right? Now, if we had some kind of explicit social contract, it would say, you're in your lane, come this way, I'm in my lane, going this way. So therefore, we should, however we want to accommodate it, stay in our lanes, right? And so that's the one lane going one the other way. But what I started to realize was, while I was very sensitive to it, and I was very cognizant of these lanes that were in our physical environment, most often these white men didn't care, right? So I'd walk up the hill to our car, and coming down the hill would be 3 or 4 white college students walking sort of next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, coming down, right? And what I would start to notice is that other people would also do that. Most likely women and other people of color would often just step into the grass, even step off the curb into the street to make the accommodation for these men walking down the sidewalk. So, as a psychologist, I ran an experiment. Right? Sort of an experiment to see what would happen. So my experiment was simply, I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm going to walk up and just stay in my lane and just So quite often what would happen is these men would not even see me until I was right up on them, right? And so I got several different kinds of reactions, one of which was a surprise reaction, that I would even stay in my lane, that they could walk right up to me, right? So some of them were startled and they'd sort of, oh, I'm sorry, you know, kind of move out of the way. The other reaction is that they're frustrated that I didn't move out of the way. Like, don't you see where I'm walking? I'm walking down here, so shouldn't you get out of the way? And of course, the third kind of reaction that I got was a very angry reaction. And an angry reaction, as they're walking down the hill, and I was walking up the hill, was that they would bump shoulders, right? They would hit me as they walked by me to demonstrate their displeasure with me staying in my lane. Now, that interaction, what is that? What is that? Is that racist? Yeah, it's racist. That was racism, but not in the characteristic ways that we understand racism, as somebody having an intention and saying, you're a chink, therefore get out of my way. They didn't have to say anything like that. They had to just be operating within white space, within white normative culture, within this ideology that they own the space, they own the place, and therefore whoever is not a white person in that space doesn't belong. And therefore, because you don't belong, I get to dictate how you belong in that space. Does that make sense? Right? So intentionality, irrelevant in any of this. It is just normal process of being a white person in a white supremacist culture, in an environment where ideology supports it. Therefore, you can act congruent with oneself. There's no incongruency racism. The intentionality, of course, as I was saying before, it allows somebody to be unintentionally racist, right? Or the accidental racist, you know, as I was describing before. Of course, if we focus only on the individual, the accidental racist is able to be the accidental racist in this capacity because we give them the benefit of the doubt. And the research, the psychological research on the benefit of the doubt is very good and strong and robust, that the benefit of the doubt is most often given to white men, right? So in other words, oh, are they doing something wrong? Yeah, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Are they doing something wrong? Definitely. And that's how the benefit of the doubt works, right? And we can talk about this as racist interactions, but the benefit of the doubt also works out in employment, educational setting. Benefit of the doubt, like, yeah, you know, the qualification is a little shaky, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. You know, let's invite them in. You know, he seems like a good team player. They'll fit in. Before you know it, the benefit of the doubt creates a group of men and women that look very culturally similar to oneself. The other piece that we're going to get to, especially when we start talking about the individual, is that it really focuses on the idea that everybody is responsible. Everybody shares in the same responsibility. Everybody's responsible. It is, in a sense, a kind of racial and power, as in a racial way and a power way, flattening it out so that everybody's on the same playing field. In this way, right, white supremacy loves a level playing field. It's the only time that they'll talk about a level playing field. Does that make sense? Level playing field meaning that everybody has the same responsibility, everybody has the same ownership, everybody has the same kind of cultural investment or social investment, everybody has the same power, everybody has the same agency. You hear that, right? It is a form of, I don't see race, I only see the human race, right? And how do we play that out? In our science and our practice. And our science and our practice, we often, as an example of classroom exercises, you end up doing these kinds of exercises around white privilege, or privilege at all, just talking about privilege, right? Which is, some of you, I don't know if you've ever participated in these, but you know, it's sort of like stand in a line, you start here, we read off a list of a bunch of things, and then you start moving forward, start moving backwards, And then at the end of the exercise, you see where you're at versus in comparison to where everybody else is at, and somehow that's supposed to translate to an understanding of one's privilege, right? Pretty familiar, right? The other format, I know you can't read this, but essentially it's a list of privileges. It's a Peggy McIntosh white privilege knapsack, and Google that, get that up there. That's essentially what you get is this list of privileges. You know, I get to be with people of my own race. I won't, you know, it's those kinds of things that talk about privilege. And what happens is, because it's too individuated, it becomes a very fractured landscape in terms of how we understand privilege. What I mean by fractured landscape is that this particular format, even though Peggy McIntosh originally meant it to be a critique of whiteness and white supremacy and racism, as soon as it got into the educational system, as soon as it got into how we want to try to understand it, it broke apart. The power of the critique that Peggy McIntosh originally meant for it to have was lost. And instead, what happens is you end up with all of these different types of privileges, right? You get masculine privilege, Christian privilege, white privilege, able-bodied privilege, social class privilege, heterosexual privilege, what else? Fairly the constellation of privileges, right? But you get the idea that everybody has that. And the problem, of course, is that we don't talk about racism, we don't talk about white supremacy. We flatten it out so that all of the cultural, all of these identities, all of these different pieces are on the same level, right? That's what I mean by flattening it out. This is the only time when we start talking about white supremacy and racism where whiteness wants a level playing field. Whiteness wants everybody to be at the same line, because if you start to recognize the differences, then you start to have to acknowledge institutional and structural power, historical power, right? So for instance, it's not well tied to history, institutions, and social structures. You'll see that kind of terminology in lots of our multicultural, cross-cultural language, right? You see that history, institutions, social structures. So history is simply our history, our understanding of what has preceded us, simple enough. Institutions, banking, law enforcement, schools, institutions. Social structures, people don't understand what social structures are or what it means. Social structures literally means, or pretty much means, physical structures. The physical structures that surround us, right? Social structures around us allow us to practice race and racism, even though we don't even understand that we're doing it. I hope that makes sense. Social structures. So social structures means the buildings, the streets, the neighborhoods, right? The neighborhoods where we exist, the restaurants, all of those different things are all about how we practice race and racism every single moment, every single day, and we don't realize that we're practicing racism. Does that make sense? So, for instance, social structure might be for me, for instance, I'll go to a conference, and when I go to a conference, I walk into a ballroom, and what I immediately do is I scan the ballroom. And I scan the ballroom for how diverse it is. Who else is here? How many women are here? How many men are here? And depending on what I start to see, I have to start to think about how I want to be in that environment, right? That is a social structure where I have to practice race and racism. It doesn't have to have a label out there that says this is a social justice activity or anything like that. It's a normal day-to-day activity that you participate in, which allow you to practice your ideology, you practice your race, you practice your racism, you practice your privileges day-to-day, in and out, without intentionality. It's completely invisible to you. And that's the social structure piece, right? So when we talk about redlining residential redlining, for instance, that's a social structure, right? It's a context from which we derive meaningful information about how we want to interact with a person in that context. For instance, the research around social contextual cues, right? The built physical environment has a lot to do with how police officers decide whether to shoot or don't shoot, right? If you manipulate the background information, the thing that a white person or a black person is holding in their hand changes meaning. It's not just about the object, it's all the contextual, right? The physical built environment that has a lot to do with how you interpret, is that a cell phone or is that, right? So that has a lot to do with how we understand the practice of race and racism within the context of social structure. That's what social structure is. Institutions, history, social structures, right? So color blindness, like I was saying, flattens everything out. Everybody's responsible. Helen Neville and her colleagues define color blindness as a kind of color evasion or power evasion, sort of just avoiding the discussion around color and also avoiding any discussions around differences in power, right? So that's one way to conceptualize it. The other way to conceptualize it, and I know you're writing this down, I'm going to make these slides available, so I'll send it to Krista and they can send it out. So yeah, don't. So I see some of you taking pictures and writing down. It's like, sorry, I'll get you the slide. So Supremacy Civil also talks about this as forms of cultural racism, naturalization, minimization, as well as abstract liberalism. We've talked a little bit about all of those different pieces already, right? So color blindness, for instance, in cultural racism, is an argument, for instance, that if you're not successful, that your culture, the culture that you are from, doesn't support or encourage academic success, right? And then they'll start to look at research that tries to identify variables that says, well, you know, because of these particular factors, therefore, your cultural group and therefore you are not prone to academic success. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the other piece is naturalization, normalization of oppressive practices, right? The normalization of oppressive policies, for instance, by focusing on individual choices, is what we hear in our sort of in the media for decades. Is that, for instance, they wouldn't have gotten in trouble if they didn't run from the police, right? This is the individual. You made a poor decision, therefore that's what you got in trouble. So it's a very sort of racially causal language in terms of why people get in trouble, all predicated around this idea of color blindness, right? Color blindness really is, at the root of it, this focus on not wanting to talk about race, not wanting to say race and racism, right? So going back to the earlier slide around privilege, we focus around talking about privilege, we talk about masculine privilege, Christian privilege, and very infrequently we circle back and talk about racism. We don't come back and just say racism, white supremacy, right? We don't relocate the importance of what these particular pieces are. It's important because, it's also important because what it starts to get us into is this really weird, fractured identity of privileges and oppressive identities. In other words, it allows any one person to have in themselves identities and cultural histories of intersectionality and, let's say, oppression simultaneously with privilege. You cannot have that happen. Right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work like that, right? You're either privileged or you're not. Right? You're privileged or you're not. There's no, I've got a little bit of both. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't happen like that. You can't talk about masculine privilege, right? You can't talk about masculine privilege or male privilege when the overriding identity of threat for an African American man is being black in public. There's no masculine privilege attached to that. It's not portable like whiteness. Whiteness is portable. Whiteness has a portability of privilege and power. In other words, anywhere a white person goes, they've got privilege going with them. If you're a person of color, and this is what people would tell me, is that, listen, you're a man of color, you're a professor, you're the chair of the department, you've got privilege. Yeah, within this building, within this floor. But as soon as I walk out the door and I walk to my car, I'm a Chinaman, I'm a Chink, I'm an Asian guy. That's all that matters. There's no privilege that's afforded to me as a result of that. Right? Portability of privilege. Okay, so good on time. So I've got a couple more slides. I'm just going to wrap it up in terms of talking about some of these concepts. So we talk about white supremacist ideals and ideology, which is simply this idea that whiteness is supreme, hence white supremacy, right? That it's the best all around. It's not just and I put biological up here, but it's beyond biological. It's beyond an ontological function. It's actually a cosmological function. In other words, for many white people, they've in the background, in their head, they've been taught that you are, as a white person and white skin, something universally important. It's not just, I'm an American, it's like God ordained me to be white, and therefore there's a long history of power attached to it. So it gets into lots of different levels of how we start to understand the epistemology of white supremacy. You can't just say, oh, there's no biological basis for it. Irrelevant. If you talk about racial formation, races change boundaries all the time in terms of what is conceptualized as whiteness, right? So biological piece, that's the easy, low-hanging fruit of an argument. Don't go there. That doesn't really matter. You want to go to the epistemological function. Epistemological function has in it, built into it, ontology. What am I supposed to be? And cosmology, a larger force who's ordained and identified my skin as something important, right? So there are different levels to it. In terms of cultural function, as a psychologist, one of the things that we don't talk about in terms of white cultural values, and we've never identified because psychologists prior to this have not pulled together white supremacist ideology with cultural values, right? And so what they've not done previously, and what I'm trying to do here, is to say, if you pull those two things together, there are other white cultural values that people who are white get socialized into. For instance, and I put one of those as an example, is that for many people who are white, there's a belief that you have to be first in line. In other words, you cannot be behind somebody else. You cannot be led by a woman or a person of color. We see that in literature, right? And in my day-to-day interactions, you cannot be behind a person of color, right? Either metaphorically or physically behind a person of color, right? So, my day-to-day interactions, I've tried these experiments out as well. When there's, like if I'm at a Walgreens and there's like an amorphous sort of cluster of a line and not everybody's trying to figure out where the line starts, I'll rush up and get in front of everybody. There's no line, right? Objectively, there's nothing there. So I will, and I don't think I'm paranoid, but I'm quite certain the folks behind me are thinking, who is this guy? This Asian guy, this person of color who thinks he can get in front of me, right? He doesn't get to do that, right? Now, am I being paranoid about it? It might be. Do I think I have a realistic appraisal? I really do think that's a realistic appraisal in terms of what that particular interaction might be, right? So with respect to privilege then, privilege really is isolated to a small group of individuals, and privilege is about executing and maintaining and making sure that white territory and inequality persist. There's no equality attached to it. There's no there's no focus on everybody getting the same. It is a focus on making sure that the social structures are maintained, that the institutions are maintained, because I benefit from those institutions, and therefore I want to make sure that they continue. White space, therefore, is then a geographic space that white people understand as their territory. And it is almost everything is their territory, right? And so examples of white space control, right, happen day to day. And you see it in anytime you hear somebody say, go back to your country, or you should speak English, and you shouldn't speak, it should be Spanish, but they'll say you shouldn't speak Mexican. And so, you should go back to that is a form of white supremacist ideology, white cultural values, and privilege coming together in white space that allows people to feel that they are empowered and authorized to surveil and police non-whites in white space. Does that make sense so far? So we'll have a Q&A afterwards, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And therefore, racism is about the expansion of territory as well as the perpetuation of inequality, right? So racism, for instance, is if you can make an environment hostile enough, you don't actually have to do anything to maintain inequality. Now, you can make the environment hostile enough, for instance, where a Latinx kid decides that they have to go somewhere else or change classrooms or go to another university in order to feel safe. Now, let me just say here too, that it's very possible, and we see this all the time, that Latinx kid going to another institution is going to have a great education, they're going to have great instructors, great mentors, and yet inequality persists. Why is that? The reason is because as soon as they leave that white institution, they leave the center of white cultural capital, right? They lose the social networks that exist within white cultural spheres. And so inequality persists, right? You can go there, but if you go there, you don't go there, right? So that's part of the problem. Inequality persists as a result of toxic environments. So let me just end here. I know that I'm going to put up some sort of final points, and then go to my next presenter, so we have enough time for discussion. So the purpose of what's this sort of environment that we're in, when we start talking about acculturation is really to make sure that people of color acculturate to white standard normative values and expectations. It is, and they do it via microaggressions, racialized trauma, all those things that communicate either explicitly you can't do things or you should do things a different way. But all of those behaviors are a way in which you remind people of color in white space that they have to move in one direction. And white cultural dominance is critical because you're not being acculturated to other cultural groups, you're really being acculturated to white cultural values and beliefs, right? It is also a way to normalize and rationalize white fragility. And I call it racial innocuousness. In other words, for many people of color, what happens is, if you want to be successful, if you want to exist within a white dominant sphere, and let's say you want to keep your job or keep your position, you learn how to deal with white people's emotions and feelings and affect and their needs. You know it before they even know it. You've already taken care of it, right? And if you want to exist and prosper in those environments, you also need to be racially innocuous, right? And racial innocuousness means that you learn to play down your Asian self. You get to play down your Black self, your Latinx self, your Native American, whatever it is, you play it down so you don't cause any disruption, you don't cause an elicitation or triggering of fragility, right? It's like, wow, you're really dressed kind of black today. Like you don't want to do that because that represents a inappropriate, that represents proven white fragility, right? And I would also argue that we learn, people of color and women and lots of people with marginalized and minority identities learn very quickly how to adapt and take care of dominant people's feelings. We're very good at that. Because if you want to exist, you want to thrive, you want to be successful in any measure in the white dominant sphere, you have a sixth sense about what's happening already, right? And it is exhausting. Exhausting, right? So when you get home, for many people of color, other folks with other marginalized and intersectional identities, when you get home, you're like, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm just tired. It's exhausting. And psychologists consider that kind of like racial battle fatigue. It's a day-to-day interaction. It's not even that you're dealing with racism. You're just dealing day-to-day, right? If you ask the person, hey, how's your day-to-day? Did you experience any racism? Like, no, not in the classical sense, right? But is it exhausting? Definitely. How is it borne out? It's borne out somatically. It's borne out physiologically. So, for instance, the research shows that African Americans and Latinx individuals who are successful economically and educationally still carry with them physiological problems. They still have all of these stress symptoms, even though they live in the best houses, they went to the best schools. What is that? That's ecological environmental racism. Space. Racism in the space. And it doesn't come from somebody intentionally making a racist or comment or a racist interaction. It's day to day in that space. Okay? As I said before, rationale and for surveilling and policing, that ideological function authorizes people to feel like they can do that. And then ultimately, because we go back to the foundational white cultural values in terms of the belief that people who are white need to be number one, there's never going to be a kind of equality. It's always going to be in our current system about limiting the number of people who can be ultimately successful, right? Now you can have the verbiage and you can have the ideological pieces out there about meritocracy and working hard and all those different pieces. And then you can have the day-to-day interactions about who gets ahead. And those two things are not convergent. They're not convergent. And I would argue have never been convergent. But meritocracy presents itself as a very sexy ideology about how we get ahead, but the day-to-day reality is much different. Okay? All right. So I'm going to stop, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for the other presenter, Edwin, and then we'll Q&A afterwards, right?
Yes, thank
Okay,
you,
all
Will.
right, thanks.
Great. So, as we transition, I'd like to then introduce Edwin Mayorga, who's here from Swarthmore. Maybe
How does
not.
cheering squad?
I don't know any of them.
And so, yeah, kind of complementing, so Will's work on white supremacy and white public space, thinking now about a race radical approach to education and policy. And so, Edwin is a parent, educator, activist, scholar, an assistant professor of educational studies of Latin American and Latino studies at Swarthmore College. His various articles, presentations, and projects examine a number of different areas in educational studies. He works with urban education and social policy, critical ethnic studies, and participatory action research. He has two major projects currently, the Education in Our Barrios project, BarrioEd, well, there's a hashtag, you can look at it, and learn about it, which I'm looking forward to doing myself. And a youth participatory action research collaborative based in Latinx core communities in Philadelphia, and the Community Schools College Partnership Study, which examines K-12 school and community partnership models in Philadelphia. So very community-based engaged research. And in addition, he's co-leading 2 critical digital curricular projects to support students and teachers, and the Pedagogy and Power syllabus. He is on the, Ethnic Studies PHL and the Pedagogy and Power syllabus. He's on the National Advisory Board of the National Latino Education Research and Policy Project, and he is co-editor of the book, What's Race Got to Do with It? How Current School Reform Maintains Racial and Economic Equality. And he co-edited this book with Bree Picauer, who's going to be visiting us later in our speaker series in the spring. So, Edwin, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that very nice introduction. So, can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Yeah. All right. So I'm using my teacher voice. Okay, so my conversation or dialogue today is around what I've been trying to theorize and put legs onto is this notion of race radicalism and how that operates in research, policy, and practice. Yeah. Before I proceed, though, I want to recognize the land, right? So to begin, we want to acknowledge that we're presently occupying the traditional territories of the Pamunkey and the Piscataway people. In making this land acknowledgement, I express our gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we are on. And we honor the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. As we contemplate race radicalism in policy and practice, let us not forget the impossibility of freedom on stolen land. And that should never be far from our thoughts and our politics. So I thank you for joining me in recognizing the land and the people that have been part of this land for millennia. Okay, so what's race radicalism? In a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that race radicalism is anti-racist thinking, struggle, and politics. And that those practices, right, and I really appreciate, Will, your point of practice and intentionality. And then what I'm going to argue is that race radicalism is something that by necessity requires, because of its marginality, requires intentionality. We choose our politics. We choose the way we think and struggle in order to disrupt, dismantle, and imagine otherwise. And so specifically with race radicalism, what I'm talking about is that it's a practice, an engagement, and a reckoning with the material and cultural violences that have been perpetrated by a social system based both on racism and global capitalism as something that are inextricably entangled into one another. While I have been thinking a lot about how, while I've been thinking a lot about both racism and capitalism and how they function, what I'm trying to do in this, both in my thinking and in my politics and my teaching, my pedagogy, right, our practice, pedagogical practice, is to think about them in entangled ways. And that, it ends up leading me into all kinds of sorts of harried and sunken places. But I think for me, it's what's most generative, or it's a site of generation, right, of problem posing, to take from Paulo Freire and critical pedagogues, of generative kinds of thinking. Now, we do all this thinking for what? The demand for me ultimately is to get free. And that it's not just my individual freedom, but our collective freedom, right? If Will is not free, I am not free. If any of you out here are not free, then I am not free. And so what does that look like? Thinking about collective liberation, self-determination, and decolonization. And there I'm thinking very materially about the land as well as culture and how those things intersect. Now, I'm going to have way more than the 30 minutes will allow. And I'll be throwing lots of different words and things, so I'm going to try to move quickly. But three kind of key things that I've already started to mention a little bit is when we are thinking about, when I'm going to try to tie these thread lines through talking about research, talking about policy, and talking about practice. And woven into those, what I'm trying to talk about are understandings of what dominance is, what sobrevivencia is, and the work of imagining otherwise possibilities. So, research. Research here, what I'm focusing on is the framework, our lens for thinking about these things. And so, race radicalism for me is a stance that emphasizes the twining, right, of racism, political economy, class inequality. I think, another dimension to this, well, there are multiple dimensions if we're thinking intersectionally, right? Race radicalism for me is a kind of entry point into intersectional kinds of politics and thinking. But thinking about the way that weaves in with gender, disability, and other forms of intersecting forms of oppression, and how those things then become entry points into understanding oppression in all of its multiplicities. But for me, that particular entanglements of race and political economy are my kind of focus right now, at least in the work and the things that I'm doing and thinking about. Now, a key piece of that then is this notion of racial capitalism, that the social conditions in which we live, right, these kind of saturation of thinking about white supremacy, and it was interesting, when you were talking about when we are in a particular conjunctural moment where we are thinking about neoliberalism and individualization, and I think the way I understood what you were arguing, Will, is that is synonymous with white supremacy, right, and a white individualization. And what I'm trying to think about is how they articulate one another, right, to create a kind of chorus, right, of white supremacy and economic inequality, right? So hence my use of the term racial capitalism here, and thinking about how those things then function in our daily lives, in our institutions, and in our policy, and those kinds of different dimensions of social life. The other piece that's particularly important for me from a more methodological kind of perspective is race radicalism as focused on two things in particular in my work. One is the notion of how do we map dominance, right? We often think about oppression, and we start to formulate or think about the subject, right? Or the object of study being those who are oppressed. But we sometimes lose sight of how does that oppression function, right? In what ways are people being dominated? In what ways is coloniality operating? If we look at the island of Puerto Rico, right? How does the function of coloniality continue and persist while continuing to be adaptive to changing economic interests, agendas, needs? If we're looking, at over a century of colonial control, or multiple centuries for the island of Puerto Rico in particular. But thinking about those things. At the same time that I'm trying to map dominance, I'm also trying to honor and document sobrevivencia, right? What Native scholars have talked about as, and let me skip that quickly, just for a second. The way Native scholars, Gerald Wisner, have talked about as survivance, right? Survivance being a desire to live beyond the survivable name. It's an active practice, right? It's a sense of presence over absence, deracination, and oblivion. So that kind of, those modes of survivance revolve around the continuation of stories, right? Of lives, of histories, of culture, in the face of erasure. And so what does it mean for us to live beyond just surviving? Which is often, in policy structures, we often think about as, oh, if people are surviving, that's our baseline. And I think survivance is a call for going beyond accepting that as the sheer fact. So just very quickly going back, I didn't want to go through all of these, but as we're thinking about, so coupling survivance and dominance, right, in conversation with one another, sobrevivencia, thinking about the way racial capitalism in our current moment works, right, valuing of the market and the individual, the role of the state, right, the government, and these kinds of institutional bodies then operating in certain ways. In the literature, particularly around more political economic perspectives, we've traditionally have thought about the state being reductive, right, or reducing the state and its influence over individual lives. And what research has actually shown is that in our neoliberal moment, it's what we might think about as a hollowing out of the state, but it's not getting rid of the state, right? So you just hollow out its accountability to people, but what you do is you maintain its powerful structures, right? Its different arms and branches in people's lives, right? And so, coupling that with thinking about our technological advancements and our information economy, if we think about the way surveillance and kind of more economic thinking nudge theories and all of those kinds of things become reflections of the arms of the state functioning at the same time that the accountability to those people that it's trying to nudge and move has been evacuated. We think in education, we think about, and in labor, we think about the weakening of unions, the privatization of things, but in ways that are what Jody Melamed has talked about as these kind of official anti-racist liberalisms. And so it veils the way that people are set up to maintain inequality and advance profit accumulation. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about as different aspects of dominance. Now, in education specifically, as part of our conversation. So, in the book, "What's Race Got to Do with It?" that Brie Pickauer, who maybe she'll talk about it too, and I have worked on, and we will actually be publishing a second edition in 2019, we hope. The working metaphor for racial capitalism and dominance is the Hydra, right? Everyone familiar with the Hydra? What's special about the Hydra?
You cut off a head, 2 more grows.
Yeah, you cut one off, 2 more, 3 more, 15 more. This was our working metaphor, and this came from both Brie Pickauer and I were part of the New York Collective of Radical Educators, or NYCOR, in New York City, a grassroots collective of teachers who are committed to justice in the classroom and in the streets. And that was from the organizing, our analysis group. And we were trying to think about, okay, we've had to put out all these fires, little things, not little things, but it felt like almost as I'm not in isolation, right? Individualized kind of policy issues, right? So we need, there was the ramping up of high stakes testing, and I'm sure, DC has seen plenty, right? This I know. Mayoral control, charter schools, school closures, union busting, TPA kinds of teacher education, reimaginings of what teacher education is supposed to do and prepare young people for in the teaching force. Notions of philanthrocapitalism, the rise of philanthropy as being a major player both in policy and practice in schools. And so we were finding all of these little, what were presented as disparate activities. And what we're trying to argue actually is that they are, while not always in coordination and sometimes often in contradiction to one another, there was an underlying kind of grammar, right? An underlying logic or circuitry that was animating all of these things, right? And so this is what we think about as racial capitalism, or in this current moment, right now, racial capitalism, and I do want to recognize Cedric Robinson and his work in Black Marxism as being the naming of this kind of concept. And what Robinson has demonstrated, right, is that the relationship between race and capital has been ongoing. It's an ongoing project. And so racial neoliberalism is just a description, one potential description of our current moment of racial capitalism. But even if we trace just the history of the United States and looking at plantation, enslavement, and colonization as being a different moment in racial capitalism, and moving through Jim Crow and those kinds of eras, which interestingly in the kind of in the new edition of the book, my colleague Tom Lynch and I are working on data streams, right, in education, like educational data. And when you go and look back, actually, this is a very brief slide, I hope. You'll see when did we start start accumulating and gathering educational statistics, and we're looking right at the moment of post-Civil War Reconstruction, right? So it's interesting to think about how data started to become part of a way of what Patricia Clough and Craig Wilsey talk about as population racism, right? You create populations, right? You formulate these populations for particular kinds of job sectors, to live in certain places, right? The spatialization of race and containing certain people, right? If we look historically at reservations and the dramatic escalation of prisons in the 20th, in the late 19th and 20th century and into the present. So really kind of thinking about it over long periods of time, but then focusing in on what's happening right now and situating that kind of discussion. All right. Now, one last piece is more methodological and thinking about par entre mundos, right? So participatory action research between worlds, right? And this is work that has been developed by colleagues of mine, Jen Ayala and company, and really trying to think about participatory action research from a hemispheric global South perspective, right? And so really drawing from those kinds of approaches. And so the theoretical kind of work that I'm doing around racial capitalism links with the participatory action research work that I'm trying to wed to one another. So thinking about participation, critical inquiry, knowledge construction. And are people familiar with participatory action research? Sometimes I just start talking about it. No. Okay. So participatory action research is a particular, how many of you have heard of action research? Okay, so participatory action research is not the same as action research. And by that, I mean, it's the participation piece that is critical here, in that participation is focused on the people, not that you are studying, but that you are standing alongside in inquiry. And that it is political, inherently political, in that you are working alongside people who are what I describe as like the most directly affected by these different structures of oppression that we are thinking about. And so participatory action research recasts, or the intention is to recast those communities as holders of knowledge, right? That they are not to be studied, but are leaders in our own studying, right? And to study up and to engage for individual, collective, communal transformation. Okay, you with me? Yeah, okay, good. And so a par entre mundos in particular, so there is a global north tradition of participatory action research, and there's a what we're trying to present here and suggest to in our northern hemisphere context, is that there has been a southern tradition as well, looking at like social psychologists like Ignacio Martín Barro, thinkers like Gloria Anzaldúa, Fausto Borda, who was a Colombian participatory action research advocate in South America. And so that those things are rooted in, they're not just add-ons, right, but are actually in the DNA of participatory action research. And so this is what I'm trying to do is link these things, and this is what shapes my engagement in our application of this kind of race radical lens that I'm trying to develop here. Okay, how am I doing on time? Just running.
You just take the time you need.
Okay, I'll be here till, okay. So now these lines are blurry, right? So I've talked about research, but it's never divorced from the policy or the practice. But just for the sake of clarity, I wanted to break them apart or bracket them momentarily. So policy and politics. So I work in Philadelphia, and so that's what I'm drawing from in terms of the example. So just to give you, are there any Philly folks out there? Yay! So I'm like, oh, I know you. If you don't know much about Philly schools, if one traces it, one gets to see a lot of the ups and downs of what's happening in American or U.S. I would say North American education, and here are just some of the more recent ways that dominance took place in Philadelphia public schools, and Philadelphia being the poorest of the 10 largest cities in the United States. And so thinking about what was happening to its educational system tells us a lot about the development of the city, as well as how the nation state then thinks about the relationship between poverty, racism, and education. And so what we see as policy, from a policy perspective, is the loss of any kind of semblance of non-democratic governance. The school district was under state-run control primarily for 17 years between 2001 and 16 years between 2001 and 2017. They experienced vast school closures, which I know was also something that affected Washington, D.C. and a number of our major cities, right? And continues to this day in different ways. The ramp up of high-stakes testing, the explosion of charter schools, and the severe slashing of budgets. Now, it was the budget that, and this is Tom Corbett, who was the governor of Philadelphia before our current governor, Tom Wolf. I don't know why everyone has to be named Tom, but he slashes the entire state budget by $1 billion. Now, one other thing that's important to know about Pennsylvania is that it doesn't have an education funding formula. And so what it does is leaves all of the districts to figure out, in relation to Harrisburg, our state government seat, to figure out how this funding is going to be allocated. So there is no formula per se. And so these are key pieces to think about. And these are just kind of demonstrations of major kind of school closings, and we see in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. Okay, so that was just to kind of contextualize how, what was happening. And in the schools, and it was, I mean, in the media became the most poignant and devastating news became individual young people. So was the loss of, or one of the key pieces was the loss of nurses, right? So schools were struggling to even open on time. And then they were making massive cuts as to different kind of job positions. And one of the key actors that were cut immediately were the nurses. And so in that time of the austerity, or when austerity kinds of measures were being put in place to cut waste, like nurses, there were young people who were dying, who actually died in school, right, or were suffering from experiences. Now, certainly not all of them would have been solved by having a nurse, but having a nurse on site could have made a difference in many of those experiences. And so you're seeing a school district that was going through dire situations. And the government's approach to solving those problems was through austerity kinds of measures, right? So restricting what could be spent on, severe cuts in major areas, losses of music teachers, librarians, and nurses were just some examples. And then that being layered upon rapid school closures, right? Severe, kind of within 2013 and 2014, around 30 schools were ultimately closed. And then those buildings themselves were then sold off, right? So where I live very close to the West Philadelphia High School, or where I do some of my research is close to Bach Technical High School, or what was Bach, and now the building was sold off, and now it's this really beautiful Art Deco building that now has like a hip hipster bar on the top, and several like pop-up shops and those kinds of things. A really fascinating kind of intersection of that as the community itself around it is being gentrified. And so you're seeing these different kinds of ways that that it was playing out. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about dominance, but I want to talk a lot about sobrevivencia, right? What did people do? No one took it lying down. One of the key players historically was the Philadelphia Coalition Advocating for Public Schools, or PCAPS, which was a multi-union community organization, youth-driven organizations coalition that organized itself around addressing primarily the school closures, but looking broadly at the various ways that that the school system was being squeezed, and that young people were then ultimately suffering, young people and families. And so PCAPS was involved in a number of political demonstrations, but also doing a lot of policy work, engaging it in trying to address these different, holding the school district accountable and providing for and thinking about how we can creatively reimagine how we fund the school system, because like everywhere else in the United States, I don't know of any exception, is primarily based on some kind of property tax, right? And so when you're in one of the poorest cities in the country, property tax and who's paying property tax becomes a key issue. Now, one of the strategies then to try to address and combat this situation was to also then develop an alternative. Oftentimes, and maybe you've seen that here in this area, or is that government will say, well, we're with you, but we just don't know what the solution is. And so PCAPS and other organizations went about the work of suggesting some solutions. And so one potential solution was community schools. The idea behind community schools, I don't know if it's visible, if people are familiar with, right? You were going to reimagine on some level that the public school was going to have some kind of full-time coordinator that was focused on what I talk about as the school community nexus, right? That those little borderlands between what happens inside the school and the surrounding community, and how the school would be reimagined as a kind of anchor for communities. The response, the idea was, particularly with the schools that were being closed, is that instead of closing them, reimagine them as this, right? Put resources in, reimagine the role of families and different community organizations that existed surrounding the schools, and allowing them and supporting them to collectively seek leadership in steering their schools, and to do what's best needed in those schools, in those particular communities. So there were different perspectives on the community school, but the mayor, our current mayor, Jim Kenney, part of his platform was to work on community schools became part of his platform, and that was a lot of it came from the advocacy work that PCAPS and other organizations were invested in. Now, when things move from an idea, right, to institutionalized as some kind of policy or a campaign, things start to change, right? And so what we started to see here was diverging perspectives on what the very definition of what a community school is, what it should be, and how it should function. So while there was a lot to be to feel positive about, and the mayor who ultimately wins and pushes. So one of the big pieces that he ran on was also moved to once he was elected was a sugary drink tax. So what we call what many places have called the soda tax, right? So the soda tax was designed to fund universalization of pre-K, community schools, and a few other main like hot item issues around the budget. Now, as that was put out, the definition of community schools became more and more fraught. And so I want to point out that while I talk about it, it was absolutely a win, right? It was something that disrupted or provided a possibility, right? Imagine something else that was, I think, ultimately vital for what direction the school system and the city was going. At the same time, it's not necessarily a silver bullet. None of these things are. And one of the major questions, and I won't have time to show this video, but I too will share the links for the presentation. But that questions around the structural kinds of questions around race, inequity, the political economy of the city, were not necessarily directly addressed by a community school policy, a proposal. And so the question that Burris and Lipman and others have asked is then who has the right to the city, and whose voices are actually being heard when different kinds of policy proposals at the end of the day get institutionalized. And so these are the kinds of things that I was looking at from a race radical perspective. And I will say, so one of the underlying things then to just kind of to continue moving on is the underlying thing is that community schools, it was always something bigger than that, what it was about. And it was in many ways about community control. That it was not just that, and I think this is one of the key pieces when you have diverging visions, right, is that community schools part of it's not the only, but one arm of the community schools, proponents of community schools have focused on providing wraparound services, including and engaging families in the life of the school. There's another strand, right? Another strand of thought that is focused on community-driven schools. So really thinking about how communities drive what schools are doing. And so this is part of what then we see in, now this is again an example of engagement and practice, is arguing or realizing and making others realize that having community schools didn't change the overall structure of the school system, right? So you would have, like, you could create exception, right? Like, oh, look at this wonderful school down on, down this street. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, there's a school that doesn't have that designation and is continuing to experience the same kinds of economic, racial kind of cultural issues that are that all of the school system has been facing. And one of the key pieces was to reclaim the leadership of the entire school system. And so people continue to organize and push around that. And so the SRC, which is the School Reform Commission, which became the kind of rubber stamping decision-making body that was driven by the state governor, after 16 years of push and then putting pressure on the new mayor, there was a push made to abolish that and to have a not an elected school board, but an appointed one that was appointed by the mayor and the city council being involved in this process. So again, not perfect, but the work continues, right? And so again, another kind of example of a win, but a kind of incremental win in a much, much longer game. So I'll say, yeah, let me, I'm drawing from Ashawn Crawley, who talks about this idea of otherwise possibilities, right? So, so very briefly, right, I'm just kind of reading towards the end, right? So perhaps the organizing that is taking place in otherwise kind of strategies operating out of a different set of concerns altogether. Fundamentally about not assenting to current configurations of power and authority, but about creating new lines of flight, of force for operation, for action, right? So to think otherwise is not to be outside of it, but actually thinking about what is that beyond, right? And not continuing to just spin our wheels. And so a lot of the activists and people, now PCAPS, the organization I talked about earlier, no longer exists. And some of the work that I'm doing with some other colleagues is looking at, what are some of the reasons why organizations kind of come and go, and what's sustainable and what's not. Another conversation. I'll be happy to talk about that another time. But what I think is important is that there were a number of people involved in that, and that continue to do the work of imagining and otherwise, right? And that these wins, like having community schools implemented on to a degree, the abolition of the School Reform Commission, that those things are still not enough, and that we have to continue this kind of work. So organizations like Philly Sun, which is Philadelphia Schools Unifying Neighborhoods, part of their work, and one of their members is and leader is Pep Felton. Pep, who talked about in an interview, she talked about, we have principles about what we want around community schools to look like, and I think for the most part that's aligned with the city's plan moving forward. Culture of curriculum, yes. Practices around discipline, looking at transformative restorative justice, but also then thinking about different ways to measure success, right? We need to completely reimagine how we are thinking about these things in order to actually create the kinds of change systematically down into the roots, is really what Pep was talking about here. And so from those voices and other voices and people that I've interviewed and worked alongside, the thing that I'm thinking about then are what race radical views on community schools, what a race radical view of education would look like. And part of it is, in the example of community schools, like community-led, right, community-driven, connected, going beyond wraparound services, the idea of thick participation, right? That participation is not just everyone, we got everybody to show up and we've checked off, like we did attendance and that's what happened, right? Thick participation is relational, right? It's about upending that kind of teacher, that outside the school, the kind of borders that have been created between school and community. And that those things are centered then on humanizing one another, right? How do we see those things? How do we navigate that? And that the curriculum itself is that this practice that we are imagining that parents and school leaders and teachers would be involved in has to be the living core of what happens in classrooms, right? A humanizing kind of pedagogy. And so I'm kind of running out of time. And one other thing that is thinking about then is race radical practices. And Philadelphia I'm inspired by these teachers, by a number of teachers that have been leaders in the teaching with Black Lives Matters at school, inspired by the work that was done by John Muir, the John Muir School in Seattle. These teachers took on doing that, wanting to replicate that in Philadelphia. And so it's now become a week, and now it's become a national kind of project. And so seeing those kinds of things, I think for me, are palpable examples of race radicalism happening in the classroom, and these are the same teachers that are out in the streets. They're always at the board meetings now, the newly appointed board. And so really kind of seeing those things in action is not only inspiring, but an example of what I talk about is active solidarities, right? So it's not about inclusion. It's also not about charity and service. It's about imagining our relationship being one premised on solidarity, and that's an active thing that we do every day with our students, with other professionals in the classroom, and so on and so forth. And so my call and my invitation is for race radicalism everywhere. So thinking about what that kind of work, what does active solidarity look like in the classroom, in the school districts, in communities, in our city. And so I will say then that race radicalism, again, as I had mentioned to begin, is anti-racist thinking, struggle, and politics. It's the practice of identifying both that despair and the forces that create it, but also a rally cry. It's an invitation. It's a calling of imagining and creating those otherwise possibilities. So I invite you all to heed that call and to be actively in solidarity with me and with the people who I hope I've done justice to in presenting the work that they're doing as truly inspirational. So thank you.
we now have some time for a Q&A, so I'll just step here and, Will, do you like to come up as well?
Yeah, I would like to.
Yeah, if you don't mind staying here, I can play motion chairs, whatever you like to do. Yeah, and now we would like to open up the floor for some questions on your part. So I see a hand already.
Hi. So Edwin, I had a question for you.
Yes, Mindy.
You stacked the audience.
Yeah, I know. She's a former student.
So I want to get it right, so I wrote it down. How do you assert the importance of otherwise possibilities in the face of the pragmatism and moderate liberalism of Washington, D.C. that would argue that with the limited time and resources we all have, that we should focus on achievable incremental change rather than a radical systemic overhaul?
I don't live here. Like DuPont Circle. So I would say I think about that the incrementalism is what Jody Melman might think about as one of those official liberal anti-racisms, because it veils, incrementalism to me veils the underlying desire to maintain things as they are. And so, and I use radicalism intentionally. I guess I didn't talk about that, but I use radicalism intentionally, drawing from Ella Baker and the work of dropping your bucket and getting down to the root of things, right? And that's what radicalism is. It's not extremism, the way it's been kind of used and tossed around in the media. It's about getting down to the roots of things. And so, to me, that's the heavy lifting that we live in a time of what Rob Nixon talks about as turbo capitalism, right? Everything has to be done quickly, and yet the violence that, the kind of racial state violence that we're experiencing, all that stuff that we see as kind of incremental and underlying, is happening in many ways and throughout history, right? And so you see this kind of like slow violence alongside turbo capitalism and to me, in order to address slow violence, combat slow violence, we need slow, thoughtful policy work that I know it runs in the face of everything that we feel, right? We feel this urgency to do things, but yeah, I'm about trying to convince people to not just slow down, but to be, more importantly, thoughtful about what's actually happening on the ground and actually talking to people rather than just kind of taking what this one white paper said about any particular community. That's how I feel about it.
Other questions? Yeah.
My question is for Dr. Luke. So I was just a bit curious on what your perspective is regarding intersectionality, because one of the things you mentioned was that you either have privilege or you don't. But I come from a biracial household, and so, and I know a lot of people that do as well, are people that are disassociated in a way where one facet of their identity might give them some sort of privilege, but another facet of their identity that is equally important and would appear oppressed. So I'm just curious about your perspective on that too.
Privilege is only set aside for white men. I hate to boil it down to that simple of a matter, but privilege in terms of institutional, cultural, structural, historical power has always been reserved for specific group of people in our society. Everybody else enjoys what I consider to be a form of proxy privilege. And proxy privilege is an affordance of an institution that allows you some semblance within a social structure, but is easily removed and terminated without any consequence to the institution or the person giving it. And proxy privilege as a form of critique is almost about the ways in which we maintain proximity to other white people. So privilege is afforded to people of color identities as a means to keep them close and as a way to diffuse or deflect critique of racism. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about portability of privilege. If you in your mind can identify a place where your privilege doesn't exist, you don't have privilege. You don't. So whatever else that you have is something else, and I'm willing to take labels for it, but if we really want to talk about institutional power that has an impact and an effect in society, it is still about a particular group of individuals. This historically has been, it still is about that. And so we can, the struggle is, sort of rooting it down to, well, for instance, folks have brought that up before to me. It's like, well, I'm biracial or multiracial, and I do have somebody who's white in my family. That's fine. But in terms of who you are outside in society, it's a whole different matter. I want to I want us to get away from this fact that, and this is part of the individualism, neoliberal kind of ideology that we've been taught, is that if I believe in myself, therefore it should happen. If I believe that I have privilege, therefore it should happen. It doesn't work like that. It's a very neoliberal, individualistic belief that you have an effect on a system, an institution, when you believe that. So I'm taking it from a very critical standpoint that it really is, to some extent, irrelevant how you identify yourself. But I don't.
No, I mean, I think
it's critique and.
No, I agree with what you're saying, Well, and I think we misconstrue, privilege with, and I really like the notion of proximity. And we talk a lot about that in Philadelphia politics, is our proximity to power. And that becomes a kind of comfort, right? That, I've got the pulse of, what's happening in education policy, for example. But that proximity may benefit you. You may receive certain benefits from that, but that doesn't make you privileged, right? It doesn't, structurally speaking, at the end of the day, perhaps you individually are benefiting, but the people, the communities that you're a part of are not structurally benefiting from, it's not changing their position, their larger kind of, in the aggregate kind of position in society.
And I like your point about solidarity. I think it really is less about my belief and my identity and my power, and it really is about, like I was starting the presentation, breaking away from this individualized approach and really thinking about it's a we collective piece, and it's a group, it's a group effort. Less so an individual ability. It doesn't work that way, right? So for instance, I've certainly been in situations where I felt like, I'm this and that and this, and I have different roles attached to my email signature line, and therefore I should have all these affordances and things. But it's dramatic how quickly, if you challenge something, how all that's pulled away. So the labels don't mean anything, right? And so suddenly in your head, I could see the space occurring between myself and the white person who is designating my position, my role. And it's hard for me to define what that, but if I upset the dean, for instance, who was a white man, and he didn't like what I was saying, very quickly you start to see this physical space occurring, and the labels and the roles and my identity are irrelevant to my proximity to that person, my access to that person, my power, and all of those things are removed, and it reflects, and there's no negative consequence. There's no consequence, not negative consequence. The consequence to that person, right? And that's the portability of privilege that we've been taught to believe that we have, that we just can just effect some change wherever we are individually.
I see a couple questions here, and I'm actually going to move so that I can see all the question askers. But yeah, I see you had a question asked. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. My name is Armani E. I'm in the Educational Transformation Program. And yesterday I attended a lecture with Brown Theory with Dr. Milner. And he brought up a great point about vicarious trauma that Black students and students of color are experiencing. And if you don't know what vicarious trauma is, in the light of Black Lives Matter and police brutality, although these incidents don't happen directly with every student of color, they still feel the ramifications from those events. And my question is, with the introduction of Black Lives Matter into the curriculum, how will that shape teacher preparation, especially going into classrooms for teachers who are not teachers of color, and who do not have a solid grasp on what's going on, but want to learn more? And then two, before you answer that, I did have commentary about the relationship building that, radical anti-racism requires. And my belief is that we don't need allies, we need accomplices, which is radically different. Allies can back out of it at any time they feel threatened, while accomplices have to get in trouble with you. So I just wanted to make that commentary. That is my question. How would that change the dynamic of teacher preparation?
First, let me say to your comment, I appreciate it, and it kind of got lost in the sauce, but that was actually one of the major points I wanted to end with, which is that active solidarity would require being an accomplice to disruption and dismantling of systems of oppression. So, yeah, because we're trapped too much in the allied kind of circuitous loop of being allies, and then that leading to lots of like white tears and all of these kinds of things and feelings of marginality, and a kind of false sense of solidarity, right? And so it becomes really dangerous and threatening to sustained transformative work. Now, as to the Black Lives Matter question, actually, Brief Pickauer and I have an article called Active Solidarities, which is a call. It's in a special issue of Urban Education that was put together by Mark Lamont Hill and Dr. Kamika Royal and friends. And what we're saying there is that we're operating from the perspective that the principles of the platforms and principles and visions that Black Lives Matter have articulated and continue to change, but are that at their core, I think, have some steady, ongoing vision that teacher education needs to shift, not just in integrating them, but to reimagining itself altogether, based on those principles, is what we're calling for in that, what became more of a thought piece, because for as much as teacher education has emerged from kind of biological deficit, perspectives to ethnocentric and multicultural kinds of education, our argument in that article, and what I'm going to argue here, is that we still live in an all lives matter paradigm, right? And that is white supremacy, and that teacher education needs to come to grips with that. It needs to come to grips with the fact that it is not outside of, as much as it may sound sweet, what teacher education does, right? And I understand and recognize I'm a teacher educator. I recognize that we are equally being teacher education is being equally affected by the kind of neoliberal, turn around education and accountability and so on. But we're calling for folks to double down, right? To double down in Black Lives Matter and to get into alignment, right? And Black Lives Matter has been very clear about the work of One, that people who are not Black, right, but we are all inextricably connected to anti-Blackness, right, and white supremacy, that we need to first get our own people, right? Like, we need to get our people, and we need to figure out what it is to do the hard work of being actively in solidarity, to be working as accomplices to this larger vision that will help all of us at the end of the day. And so that's what we're calling for in that article, and so that's what I stand behind, is really thinking about that long and hard, and that it isn't just, while it might seem like a think piece, that's the kind of heavy work that I think teacher education needs to be doing right now, or needs to have been doing for some time now.
My name is Charlotte. I'm also on the Educational Transformation program, and I kind of want to pick at the comment that you made about the white privilege, because I don't agree. I mean, I don't disagree with anything that you said, but I think also because of our intersectionality and because we are always, I just can't be a woman now and then Black later, but I'm always, our identities are always playing into a way. I think it's also important, based off of who you identify as, to understand the point of privilege that you have as well in your position. So while I might be a Black woman, my privilege come in as being an educated Black woman, and working in education and working and wanting to transform the education system. I think it's also important to realize, when going into policy, where you might be blinded from the privilege that you might have had, and working for wanting to make sure students of color and lower socioeconomic backgrounds are, have the resources that they don't have. I think it's also important to kind of realize, this is where I might be ignorant in assessing the problem, and where I kind of have to check my own privilege to ensure that, I am being holistic in my approaches.
Yeah. So I think what you've done is you've mixed in several layers of language that tend to benefit white supremacy. And one of those aspects is this notion of checking your privilege. It's language that's colorblind and works really well in classrooms where white people say, I'm going to check my privilege, and everybody does the same thing. It's not the same thing, right? You have some affordances. You have some benefits. It's not a privilege. You don't have a systemic privilege. And what I'm trying to do is pull that language back down to what it really means, which is privilege is an ability for people to act in racist ways to perpetuate economic inequality and maintain white space. Privilege is only for that purpose. Everything else that we might have is something else. And I've always gone back to, we can label it something else, but whatever it is, it can't be white privilege, because white privilege is white privilege, and that's what it is. And one of the things that's become a problem as well is that, and I touched upon this very quickly, is that because we flattened out identities so that they're all on the same playing field, is that we end up in this discussion of intersectionality with privilege and power and racism, so that everybody has the same thing. We don't. We can't do that, because then we end up in a discussion that goes nowhere. Because then everybody says we're all on the same plane. So you've got some privilege, I've got some privilege. What are you doing with yours? I'm doing this with mine. And it's not. That's not how it works, because that's not how it works outside in the world, and that's not how it's ever worked, right? And so we do have some benefits. It also gets back to, I think, the other layer of language that it starts to pull into is a very meritocratic language. And the meritocratic language is part of our educational experience, which is, if I can get all these things, all these accomplishments and things of that sort, then I should be protected because I've worked, I've earned it, I've become something I should be protected from. And that's myself. I do think communities of color and other intersectional communities have great opportunities and great power, and we thrive. So I'm not saying that we're in any state like we're just kind of getting by. We thrive, and so. But what I also want to do is make sure that we understand what is that and what is this, right? And I want to make sure that we have some construct clarity in terms of the language, because every time we get into what I'm dealing with right now is the aftermath of what was once a white supremacist critique over 30 years has become diffused in terms of its critical value altogether. And that's part of the problem that I'm seeing. So I want to just get us away from that particular notion, right? That we really have to start seeing where that institutional power was and still is. It still is there. It still is there. We see it all the time.
So then I have a follow-up to that
Yeah.
particular point. So what I'm hearing then is that we should also take out the word power from, say, like if I have what I used to say was relative privilege or relative power. And so the way that I understood my positionality was that I have relative proximity to power, given as an educator in an institution like Georgetown. So then does that mean, I guess one part is, then does that mean I should not even be talking about relative power? And two, what I'm understanding, what I'm hearing from you, the way that you're talking about it, is you're describing to me respectability. Is that being educated, being in this position that I'm in, is that I'm respectable in relationship to whiteness.
Yes. And it's all limited, right? It's all limited. In other words, it's geographically limited and structurally limited. It's proximal as well as non-portable and contingent, right? And if we don't get ourselves out of this notion that we are powerful regardless of where we are, you're in trouble, right? Right? We have the benefit to some degree that we are in these prestigious places, right? And to some extent, or most extent, lots of discussions and spaces for us to practice proximal privileges. But outside of this space, you don't have those things, right? So that's what I mean is that once I get outside of this building, I'm Asian dude. I'm an Asian guy, right? And whatever that brings to it is that. And so I can't say, hey, I'm a professor, you should give me respect or privilege. Like, nah, it doesn't work like it. It's never worked that way.
Can I just add to what you're saying? Well, I think we conflate, not just here in this room, but I think in general, we conflate privilege and proximal privilege with and proximal power with never being, that we are always, even as people who are coming from intersectionally oppressed locations, positionalities, that we are all implicated in the field of power, right? So acknowledging that, that I'm not privileged, right, does not excuse me from recognizing that I am implicated in heteropatriarchy. Absolutely, right? With my students, with my spouse, I'm never outside of that, right? And so I do exercise in some ways. We all, because we are implicated, we have a choice to make in terms of whether or not we are going to advance heteropatriarchy, for example, right? And so, so we might be advancers, we might be pushers of the system as it is, or we could be disruptors, right? We can make some choices on that level, kind of that level of agency. I think we need to. That's what I think we need to like problematize a little bit more, right? Because yes, I accept I'm not privileged, right? I don't, but I certainly benefit. I think as you nicely laid out, Will. But But I certainly can make some decisions about, because I definitely know some colleagues who are of color, grew up in similar backgrounds, and I know the decisions they make do advance these systems rather than disrupt them. And so I don't think of them as privileged, but they are certainly implicated in the system.
I think, in some ways too, that when we talk about, let's say, an African American community, hypothetically, sort of fighting against an Asian American community, I describe it as, racism is occurring, but they're not racist, right? Racism is occurring because they're playing out a larger structural pressure on these communities. What we see is these communities fighting against each other, which looks like racism, right? And people might call it racism, and I would describe it as racism, but not racism in the way that we would normally describe it as a visible racial ethnic group fighting against another visible racial ethnic group. It's racism because all they're doing is playing out the structural pressure of racism against these communities. So they end up identifying each other as enemies rather than collaborators in the same social system.
I saw one question over here, and then for students of educational transformation, we're going to have an extended workshop time with our speakers. So please, please keep your questions, and we'll make sure and and ask them again when we have that time. So let's just sure.
No. Okay, so then, Dr. Liu, Edwin, thank you, and I know we're out of time, but I guess I want to know your thoughts, and Edwin was my mentor in school, so this is a question based in that. He brought his name. So you all are both just working in spaces that kind of, I mean, I think it's obvious even from this conversation how personal and how difficult it is. How do you hold space then for your students when you bring these ideas to them, and you really do have to confront things that are really difficult about yourself, about the things you've experienced. So how do you all do that? Or I know maybe that's a really long answer, so can you share a little bit about how you all do that?
Briefly, I don't hold back on the language. Everybody's accountable, and in some ways, it's a recentering of the experiences of people of color, other marginalized identities, right? And really talk about supremacy for what it is, historically, structurally, institutionally, and just getting that language in there. Before we came here, during the summer, we had a 4-week summer course, and all we talked about was white supremacy, right? And at the end of 4 weeks, the white students were worn out. The students of color were energized. Because it was a complete shifting, and it was just one topic, 4 weeks or 4 days for 3 hours a day, right? But students of color were really energized about it because we just held to that critique, right? And it was challenging, right? And students of color, myself, my co-instructor, we were all, our first initial response was we want to take care of them. And so we had to bring that back, right? And just say, once you walk out of this classroom, the world takes care of you, right? In this classroom, we hold you responsible.
I mean, I'll just say, and I mean, you know this, but I'm a big fan of Moten and Carney's notion of the undercommons, and that higher education in particular as a that part of it is wading through the contradictions of places that weren't designed for us, and holding that institution that I knew wasn't designed for me accountable to that, and working and creating space, like counter spaces, right? Creating the undercommons with and the undercommons is for me is like a temporary space, right? But it's one that always is there, just below the kind of the surface of what is projected as college life and what we experience on the day to day, right? But that who we are, what we embody, you know, in of itself, in the relationships and who we choose to stand with, who we choose not to stand with, whether or not we even have a choice as to who we stand with, are all parts of the formation of the undercommons. And so for me, it's being very explicit about, you know, you come into my office, you come into my classroom, this space is for you to engage in the heavy work. And being, I think, I mean, what I was hearing from what you were saying is, Will, is like, you're unapologetic about it, right? And so it's like, how can we be unapologetically about this work every day? And, you know, I think, I mean, so I'm not tenured, and I know, like, the real talk, right? And so, but it's been a conscious political decision on my part to continue to, you know, ride the tide, until someone says no, right? Until someone fights me, I'm going to continue to push and stand and advocate and stand alongside my students. And my students know that. It's, you know, the administration's not always thrilled that I do that, and maybe feel like it's a problem, but I'm going to keep doing it. And you know, and I'm not naive about it. I understand that there are risks, you know, personal life risks that I'm taking. But I think the long road is, you know, the beautiful struggle, right? Is what I'm about, and what I hope that students understand, that that's what I'm there for.
Thank you. So looks like our time is up. Thank you all for participating, and thank you. For students of educational transformation, I don't know exactly what room we're going to, but we're going to a room. So don't leave.
Give them a few minutes break, just sort of like.
Yeah, we'll take a quick break, but please plan to meet us for the next portion of our day.
Yes, and I really sad that I missed it. So most of the first one.
There's that. Show out of your cot. All right.
But yeah, I think
But I'm very proud. All right, bye-bye.
I was thinking about how, based on this book, thinking like how I might frame some things for the book chapter. I was wondering what the white supremacist focus, like, version of recent history. You know what I mean? If we were going to turn it. Yeah. So that's true. It is because of what she was. I was thinking about if you were to shift the language. So, like he was saying, we don't really talk about racism.